Good morning and or good afternoon to our panelists who are overseas, and welcome to the 7th session of our 8-part Congressional Briefing Series, Israel and Palestine, Hot Topics in Congress. I'm Khalid Al-Gindi. I direct the program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli affairs at the Middle East Institute, and I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this series with my friend and colleague Laura Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace.
Thanks, Khaled. Great to be back with you today. Today's session is entitled, Where's the Palestinian Mandela? A provocative title indeed. To dig into this topic, we have with us today another outstanding panel of experts. I will introduce them in alphabetical order. They are Ahmed Abu Artema, who is a Palestinian writer and activist, and Marwa Fatafta, who is the MENA policy manager at Access Now. I should say we were planning to also have with us our friend and colleague Fadi Quran from Avaz, but for reasons beyond his control, Fadi is not with us today. We are in very good hands though with these two panelists, and we are very privileged to have them with us, so thank you.
You can read the full bios of all our panelists on the MEI and FMEP websites. Our colleagues will also put in the chat box their Twitter handles and links to articles that they've written or things that they've done that are relevant to today's discussion. And if you miss anything in the chat, don't worry. All of those materials will also be posted on the website after the event. The format is the same as it always is. We will do a moderated Q&A led by Laura and me. We'll put some basic questions to our panelists and get the discussion going. We welcome your questions as well from the audience. You can submit those through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time during the conversation, and we'll try to work those into our questions. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. Finally, please note that today's session is being recorded, and if you have any technical problems related to the webinar, please send those in the chat box and we'll try to get those taken care of. And with that, let's go ahead and begin.
Terrific. So just as a quick scene setter, in this session, we're going to explore issues surrounding Palestinian civil society, and in particular, human rights defenders and democracy activists, and the challenges and threats they face, including direct attacks by Israel, targeting by Palestinian authorities, and apathy and indifference from the international community. A lot has been going on in this sphere over the past year, including widespread Palestinian grassroots mobilization last May, linked both to events in Jerusalem and Israel's subsequent military operation in Gaza, including the killing of Palestinian civil society activist Nizar Banat at the hands of Palestinian security forces and the popular activism that followed that, including Israel's designation of 6 Palestinian major human rights and civil society NGOs as terrorist organizations, which was preceded by the targeting of NGO staff with terror charges, and of course, including the Great March of Return in Gaza. So Khaled, why don't you start us off with our questions?
Great. So Ahmed, I want to start with you as an activist, as a leader in civil society based in the Gaza Strip. Can you tell us a little bit about the situation in Gaza with respect to Palestinian civil society, organizing and activism in support of human rights, civil rights, democracy, and so forth? How does civil society seen in Gaza, for example, differ from that in the West Bank? In terms of, just given the differences in governing authorities and in governance in general, and the conditions are different as well. How are the objectives similar, and in what ways are they different? And also, if you could talk a bit about the extent to which there is collaboration in terms of civil society between Gaza and the West Bank.
Yeah, thank you, Khalid and Lara, for having me. Thanks for everyone. I'm happy for this opportunity. Actually, the situation in Gaza, I can talk about it as there is a kind of inactivity in general relating to the civil society. I think there are many reasons behind this. One of the reasons because of the human suffering among the youth in general, and the high rates of poverty and unemployment. This makes the youth less less interested in the engagement with the civil society and with the political and social work in general. And they say we are not able to secure our basic necessities, so we don't find time to engage with the society and with the activities. This is one of the reasons. I think there is another reason relating to the cancellation of the elections were supposed to hold on the last year, after the decision of the President Abbas of canceling the elections. The disappointment among the people increased. So the majority of the Palestinian people were looking at the elections at that time as the last hope that they can renew their reality, the legitimacy of their rulers. There is an opportunity for new leaders to come after the current leaders in Palestine. They are without elections since 16 years, the last election. So many generations were growing without expressing themselves to vote, without practicing their right to vote. So after the cancellation of the elections, I feel the disappointment was increasing. And there is another reason, that because of the place of Hamas in Gaza Strip. Hamas became more strong after the last events, including the confrontation on last May between Gaza and the Israeli occupation forces. At that escalation, the people looked at Hamas as hero. So when Hamas became stronger, this means that the civil society lost part of its power. So to be honest with you, I'm not satisfied on the power of the civil society now in Gaza. When it comes to West Bank, I never visited West Bank, unfortunately, as maybe the majority of my generation and in Gaza Strip and the younger generations. So I don't have a comparison between Gaza and West Bank. But when we saw the crime of the assassination of Nizar Banat, this gave us a message and gave us a sign how it's very dangerous to practice your right in expressing your political your political opinion. And I think my colleague can speak better about the situation in West Bank.
Thank you, Ahmed. And Marwa, that's a perfect segue. I want to say that we're talking about the West Bank and Gaza Strip as if they are separate entities, when obviously all of this is Palestine. And people forget that under the Oslo Accords, Israel agreed to treat them as a single territorial area. That's the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. But de facto, Israeli policy now for more than a decade, almost 2 decades at least, has isolated them from one another to the extent that it is a very different examination to understand the realities on the ground in one place and the other. So can you basically answer the same question? What is the situation in the West Bank, and to the extent that you can talk about East Jerusalem as well, with respect to Palestinian civil society organizing and activism in support of human rights, civil rights, and democracy? And you know, maybe go a little bit more into why it is different than in the Gaza Strip.
Thanks a lot, Lara and Khalid, for organizing this webinar today, and I'm happy to be with you. Directly to your question, I think in terms of civil society space in the West Bank, we've reached a precarious tipping point. There are 2 significant events that happened yesterday, and you've mentioned in your introduction. One, the assassination of Nizar Banat, a Palestinian political dissident who was criticizing the performance of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian leadership on YouTube and on social media. And that signals the increasing intolerance of the Palestinian Authority for any form or shape of peaceful political dissent in the occupied territories, and specifically in the West Bank, where they have, of course, a certain level of control, right? And I believe it might be actually the first instance of straightforward incident of assassination. And you can imagine the chilling effect of that incident on many Palestinian journalists and activists who are in the West Bank and are unable to a certain degree express their views, especially in a context where Palestinians don't necessarily view their leadership favorably. I mean, the leadership's legitimacy has been expired, as Ahmed mentioned, for 16 years, for over a decade. And the other significant incident is Israel's designation of 6 most prominent human rights organizations in Palestine as terrorist organizations. Of course, that means that they are facing the imminent threat of detention, closure of their offices, confiscation of their devices, and pretty much being banned from doing this work. And the underwhelming response from the international community is equally dangerous and scary, because it signals to Israel that you can pretty much do anything, as in labeling prominent human rights organizations as terrorists. These kind of acts are done by the likes of Russia and China and, you know, the most authoritarian powers there are in this world. And yet that, you know, there was no response from the US or from Europe, from the EU to basically pressure Israel to lift the labeling and the designation, which means that at this rate, if we continue under these circumstances, I do have a genuine fear that the Palestinian human rights movement might be annihilated, where you literally don't have a space to exercise the work and have the space to document human rights violations committed by the Palestinian Authority and by the Israeli occupation forces, and be able to use international human rights mechanisms like the UN, the current probe happening right now at the International Court, the ICC, and so on and so forth. So it's an overall dark picture, and I don't think that we are going in any positive direction as long as the Israeli authorities are not held accountable for their attack on Palestinian civil society.
Thanks, Marwa. You mentioned the use of technology it's become, I think, clearly the tool of choice to operate in the digital realm for civil society, for activists, everywhere in the world, but also in Palestine. And this is an area that is specifically part of your area of expertise. So can you talk about the positive role of technology, tools like social media and other online platforms in empowering Palestinian political engagement, organizing, activism, and so forth? how is technology being used both by Israel and its supporters and by Palestinian authorities at the same time to target and quash this very type of activism and to delegitimize it? And can you talk about the challenges that this poses for the kind of work that that Palestinians are doing in the civil society arena?
Thanks, Khaled. Sure. I mean, so over the last decade, social media has been most empowering to communities that historically have had no or limited access to traditional or mainstream media, or have restricted space, civic space, to be able to publicly organize and mobilize politically. And in the context of Palestine, as we already mentioned, I mean, the situation has worsened, but since the occupation of the Palestinian territories in 1967, Palestinians have been denied basic rights, including civil and political rights, to be able to politically organize, express themselves. I mean, we're talking about a period of time, right? And you know this, Khalid, where raising a Palestinian flag was criminalized. The very expression of Palestinian identity has been criminalized under Israeli military orders in the occupied territories. Traditional or mainstream media have also dealt with Palestinians by systematically objectifying them, you know, rendering them mere voiceless objects for journalists to report on without having Palestinian voices on board. So, you know, a lot of ink has been spilled on Israel-Palestine. There's been so much coverage. And I believe that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been one of the most documented and covered conflicts in the modern times, yet Palestinian voices are nowhere to be heard or found. There's actually a very powerful study done by a Palestinian media scholar, Maha Nassar, in 2020. She analyzes mainstream media, and she looks at the two most powerful newspapers in the US and around the world, the Washington Post and the New York Times. And she the results or the findings are really mind-blowing. So from 1970 until 2019, there were around 2,500 op-eds published in the New York Times. Less than 2% of those were written by Palestinians. And in the Washington Post, similar number of op-eds, less than 1% of those were written by Palestinians. And that would probably propelled the Palestinian thinker Edward Said to pen his famous article following Israel's invasion of Lebanon, you know, the permission to narrate, right? Because there's a lot of facts about Palestine and Israel. There's a lot of documentation of Israel's abuses and human rights violations in the occupied territories. But the question here is, from whose lens are these events being told? And I think under those historical circumstances, Palestinians found in social media and new technologies a new alternative civic space where they can exercise that right that they have been denied for a long time, to be able to share their stories in their own words, in their own narrative, to be able to piece that narrative together and share it with the rest of the world, as we've seen last year during the events of Sheikh Jarrah and the bombardment of Gaza that ensued. And to be able to document, right? I think documentation of human rights abuses are extremely important to preserve the narrative, and they're also part of building a Palestinian archive. And actually, I would say that Palestinians, as a matter of fact, have been one of the very first people to use social media for political purposes. Often the example of Iran and the Green Revolution in 2009 is mentioned as one of the first examples of using social media for political purposes. But a year before that, Palestinians during Israel's war on Gaza in 2008, 2009, used hashtags and used Twitter and social media to cover and provide coverage for that war at the time. And to your second part, to the second part of your question, Khalid, regarding challenges and threats that Palestinians face using the internet, going back to the examples from 2008 to the present moment in time, that digital ecosystem has changed quite drastically. And for a number of reasons, and that might take me a lot of time to explain, but I'll try to be as succinct as I can. I think between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, every government or authority, so that is the Israeli authorities, the PA and Hamas in Gaza, have found in this online space a need for it to be closely monitored and controlled for a number of reasons. For the PA and Hamas to quash and crack down on any political dissent, especially as people are becoming more and more angry with the current leadership. And of course, for the Israeli government to shut down any Palestinian activism and to be able to stop the flow of Palestinian documentation of their abuses. And there are two kind of actors or maybe two ways, right, in which this control has taken space. For Palestinians in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority has, just to share some examples of what they've done to be able to control that space. One, they've decided to block websites that publish content that is critical of the PA, right? So the first incident of blocking website was in 2008. I believe they blocked back then a media outlet that was critical of the PA. And since then, there's about 60 websites that either belong to independent media or to Hamas, or affiliated with Hamas, or affiliated with Fatah rivals. Those are blocked. Then the PA came up with this draconian cybercrime legislation in 2017, which has been used to stifle freedom of expression and political dissent online. Some of the very first cases of individuals prosecuted under this law were actually Palestinian journalists. And so even though the PA says, we're using this law to combat cybercrime, such as online fraud and child pornography, its actual purpose is to target and prosecute Palestinians, political dissidents, journalists, and human rights defenders. Hamas, is not any better. They also have prosecuted a lot of internet users in the Gaza Strip under Trump charges of misuse of social media. And of course, the Israeli authorities here takes the lion's share. Of course, they have more resources and ways in which they can control that space. They started created the cyber unit in 2016, whose main purpose is to monitor social media and send in bulk requests to social media companies in order to remove content that violates their terms of services. And as a result of that, thousands, if not more, of Palestinian content has been removed without transparency and in a very arbitrary manner, as we've seen last year during the events of Sheikh Jarrah. They've been using also an extremely sophisticated artificial intelligence powered predictive policing system, whose job is to monitor social media posts written by Palestinians and flag so-called likely attackers. So people who have not committed any crime, but the system flagged as a possible likely attacker. And as a result of that, thousands of Palestinians, especially young Palestinians and teenagers, really have been detained for innocuous Facebook posts. Or changing their profile picture on the grounds that maybe in the future they might commit an attack. And as you know, Khalid, for Palestinians, they're not granted any fair trial or due process. So you can be detained or put under administrative detention for 6 months to be renewed indefinitely without a charge. And in some of the cases I've seen and read, some kids have been faced with a screenshot of their Facebook post. And when you ask, okay, what is the actual evidence of this person, being involved in so-called terrorism? These are undisclosed. They can't disclose them for security reasons. And of course, now we've all heard about the Nso Group, which is an Israeli spyware company whose spyware Pegasus has been used by democratic and authoritarian governments around the world to spy on activists and human rights defenders. And that sophisticated spyware has been also used in the occupied territories, as was revealed last year in November, that 6 Palestinian human rights defenders had their devices hacked using Pegasus, and 4 of whom actually work for the Palestinian organizations who were designated as terrorist organizations a month prior. So here we see a clear link between online repression and offline repression and how this goes hand in hand. And one last thing I want to mention here is, of course, Israel is relying on these sophisticated technologies, on artificial intelligence, on biometric surveillance technologies like facial recognition technologies planted across the West Bank in checkpoints. They collect the most sensitive of personal data, that is your biometric data that you cannot delete or alter. Actually, yesterday, Haaretz published a report that says that Israeli soldiers are not only competing to collect as many biometric data of Palestinians, but they are not allowed to end their shift in any given day before they collect the names and the photos of at least 50 Palestinian individuals to feed their biometric database. So we're talking about automating a system of apartheid, automating occupation, and driving the oppression that happens in the occupied territories at an industrial scale. To wrap up, perhaps I would say that for any Palestinian at this moment in time, to exercise your right to freedom of expression is akin to walking between the raindrops while trying to stay dry. So unfortunately, it's really difficult. If you're not detained by the PA, you might be detained by Israel, or if you are in the Gaza Strip, of course, Hamas can always prosecute you or interrogate you based on whatever you published online.
Thank you, Marwa. And that was a really, I think, brilliant summary of a lot of factors that are sort of closing in on Palestinians and civil society. Ahmed, I wanted to come back to you and dig in a little more on sort of the objectives of civil society engagement. And you mentioned, both of you mentioned the issue of elections and the lack of legitimacy of the current leadership. There was a lot of talk about elections this time last year, and civil society was deeply engaged in preparing for those elections, debating what the objectives were, how they should take place, and obviously they were canceled. I want you to dig into that a little bit. First of all, for why elections matter under occupation, right? As long as there's still the overarching occupation, why is it that elections are important to Palestinians? And for a generation of civil society actors that have not had any taste of democracy yet, what they hope to achieve with elections now, and what you think the prospects are. And this is something that really crosses, because it's clear there will be no elections unless they can take place in all of the areas, right? West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, that's a red line politically. So what are the prospects of that moving forward, and what is civil society's role perhaps in making that happen?
Yes, thank you. The elections was important because it's an opportunity for many generations. They never vote. and because there is the leadership in general in Palestine, and not only in Gaza and West Bank, but also if it comes to the PLO representatives, they represent the Palestinian people across the world. The National Council. So the people need to feel that their leaders represent them, and they are elected by them. Then this can increase the responsibility of the leaders, and this will protect the leadership from the dictatorship and from the corruption. When the current leaders, when they are still in their places since 16 years from now, so this means there is no accountability. This means that there are new generations. They don't feel that those leaders represent them, and this is very dangerous. So even if we are against Oslo Accords, that the Palestinian Authority were based on the Oslo Accords, but the elections, we don't look to the elections only as one of the products of Oslo Accords, but it's the right of the generations. It's the right of the people. How can you, as a person in the leadership, how can you speak on behalf of me, and I don't have the right to vote, to choose you, and I don't have the right to ask you, I don't have the right to bring you to the accountability. So the cancellation of the elections was very make many disappointment among the people, because this means that the leaders will not care more about the general opinion, the opinion of the Palestinian people, because their legitimacy came from the power, and came from the relations with Israel, the security coordination, or the power, not came from the what the people want. And by the way, this is why the PA killed Nizar Banat. They killed Nizar Banat because he increased his voice against the dictatorship and against the corruption. They feel that he passed the red lines, that it's unallowed for some activists or parties to break the silence, and to make a general opinion, to make a pressure against the people who are in the circles of responsibility. So we should increase, not only because yes, the elections is our right, but because to engage the new generations, the young people who never engaged in any political work, to engage them in the cause of their people, in their cause, and to make them feel that this is our cause. For me, as example, now I'm 37 years old. In 2006, I was about 21, and I practiced my right to vote at that time. It was the first and the last time until now. But so I can make comparison between my feeling at that time and the feeling of the generations today, the new generations, here we call them the generations of TikTok and Instagram, because sometimes we feel that this is the only window of them, the only space of them to express their selves. When I speak, when I make discussion with with the young people and ask them about the political issues, and many times I feel disappointed. I feel they don't care about this, and this is very dangerous for us on the national level. At my time in 2006, when I was in the same time, I was able to feel how my generation at that time very active in the political work, and because they had the opportunity at that time to express their selves on the social and the political work. Yeah.
Thanks, Ahmed. Ahmed, if I could stay with you, I wanted to ask you about something that you are probably best known for, both inside and outside of Palestine, which is as your role as one of the key organizers of the Gaza March of Return, which I believe was about 4 years ago that it was launched. Tell us a little bit about what that march was supposed to do. Many of us probably remember the kind of weekly protests that were happening at the border fence in Gaza. What was the rationale behind the organizing the March of Return? What did you hope to accomplish by it? And what happened to it? How it, it's been a couple of years now since we've seen people protesting at the border fence, but also tell us what happened to it and how Israel responded to those protests.
Yeah, if we want to speak from the side of the national side, the Great March of Return was like a scream at that time from the people who are under the siege and who feel that how their national cause is dangerous in the light of Trump's plan at that time. So it was a necessary step that we sent a strong message that we have the insistence to continue our struggle for freedom and for our national rights. But if we want to bring the March of Return to the same context about the political work, and the civil society, the March of Return was an important opportunity at that time for the youth and for the civil society to show its role and to show its activity in the national causes. So at that time, even before the Great March of Return started, I found high activity from hundreds of youth and from tens of the civil society organizations, that they felt at that time that this is our role, this is our cause, this is our movement. We should let it succeed at that time. So the March of Return was important not only because its goal, but also because the organizations and the civil society and the youth who participated in that march and felt how this march is very important for them. Yes, about the Israeli reaction, Israel used the lethal violence against the protesters. The protesters never represent any threat against the Israeli soldier at that time, but Israel, for political reason, decided to use the lethal violence against the protesters to kill the soul, the spirit of this idea, because Israel is trying to keep us as Palestinians in the situation of silence, in the situation of inactivity. When the March of Return started, we feel how the dynamics of the society activate at that time, and how the mood of the people changed, and how the soul of the Palestinian people increased at that time. This what makes Israel feel dangerous from this idea and from the Great March of Return. So it decided to use the lethal violence, and to that hundreds and thousands of the protesters were injured, to make the Palestinians despair from any positive thinking in this road, the road of how to resist, how to fight and struggle for freedom. Yes, I'm sorry, because the March of Return didn't continue. But I think it gave the example for the people, not only inside Gaza, but also the Palestinian refugees in Jordan, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, in West Bank, everywhere. It gave them the example. So I think this idea, the idea of the March of Return, it's very deep inside the Palestinian refugees' hearts. So even if it stopped, we saw in last May how the refugees from Jordan and Lebanon spontaneously they came to the borders, and they say we want to return to our homes. So yes, the Palestinians never forget or give up their right to return to their homes. But if we will have another opportunity in the future, I hope that the civil society have a better role, a greater role in the than the factions in the March of Return, because we don't want this kind of resistance that it's controlled by one faction or one movement, or even if many movements, then they can Israel and the other countries, the other governments can make a pressure against them. But when the resistance has grassroots from the civil society, this will make this march or this activity in general stronger, and it will make for Israel more difficult for Israel to kill this idea. So I'm not satisfied on the role of the civil society. I feel that they can be more active in the March of Return, and has better places of leadership in the March of Return. Then this can make our society and our people more diverse.
Thank you, Ahmed. And for folks who have been following the series, we actually did in another session of the series focused specifically on refugees and the call for return. I highly recommend that. That was featuring Omar Al-Tabari from Zafrot, Hani Al-Matoun from UNRWA USA, and Francesca Albanese from Georgetown University. Terrific session. But so Ahmed, you gave me a perfect link to what I want to come to with Marwa, which is, so, on the heels of the Great March of Return, last May, we saw tension and clashes in Jerusalem, which I referenced earlier. This is over Israeli policies targeting East Jerusalem residents. And then there was a major Israeli military operation in the Gaza Strip. And then we saw related clashes in the quote unquote mixed cities inside Israel, which included heavy-handed Israeli security tactics against Palestinian citizens. And in the wake of that, we saw widespread punitive arrests of Palestinian citizens. So all of this appeared to mobilize and to reflect a powerful sense of shared purpose and shared future amongst Palestinians across geopolitical borders, right? This fragmentation between the areas that we talked about earlier, uniting Palestinians, West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, and inside the Green Line. So I want you to talk about that. Where do you see that going? Starting with the Great March of Return through the arc of where we are today. And also, can you talk about the role of technology in breaking through the barriers and in fixing or challenging the fragmentation that has been imposed on Palestinians over the years, including Palestinians in the diaspora, by the way?
Yeah, thanks, Lara. I mean, as a matter of fact, the events of last year are called the Intifada of Unity. Specifically for the point you mentioned, I live in the diaspora, even though I don't label myself as a Palestinian diaspora. I have family in the West Bank and I go there regularly, but there was a shared sense of unity. And we have been going through decades of political stagnation. Maybe stagnation actually is not the right word, deterioration since the failure of the Oslo Accords and the two-state solution paradigm. These have not worked. The international community's promises to the Palestinian people have not materialized. It's 2022, we don't have a state, and there is no hope that we're going to have a state on some extremely fragmented, limited geography. Now, for the first time since the spark of the protest in Sheikh Jarrah, it was started by a number of families in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem who are facing the imminent threat of eviction from their homes. And by that I mean in the larger scheme of things, it means the ethnic cleansing of East Jerusalem and emptying it of its Palestinian indigenous population and substituting that with Israeli Jewish settlers. It's been an Israeli policy since time immemorial. So that evolved, and a lot of Palestinians, including myself, have been watching, I live in Germany, I have been watching what is, the events on the ground on social media. And for the first time, there was a revived sense of hope and purpose and agency. I think agency is an extremely important element here, because for a long time, we felt that we've lost our agency over our own present and future. We have, as we said and already discussed, we have a Palestinian leadership who's been expired, extremely old, disconnected from the Palestinian people, their needs. And by the Palestinian people, I don't mean those of us who live in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, but also those who live in refugee camps and live, there are 10 million Palestinians who are living in exile or in diaspora. And those are being completely dismissed, they're not even on the books of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian leadership. And we see, of course, also the PA or the Palestinian leadership adopting this, using the words of Noor Ariqat, this policy of acquiescence, just giving up and maybe hoping that the international community will grace them one day and fulfill the promise of this state, right? And as I said, for once, Palestinians were able to mobilize. There were no Palestinian factions being involved in street mobilization. And we felt that actually it's not all doom and gloom. The issue has not been resolved, and not resolved, but it has not ended yet. There's still space for us to mobilize. There's still space for us to make change and difference. Now, to your second part of your question, you know, I have been studying digital activism and social justice movements and resistance movements in the MENA region for almost a decade. And one conclusion I can share is that online activism is great, has opened a lot of new doors, but it's not sustainable, and it cannot really fulfill the purpose of liberation or fulfill the purpose of social justice and political change on its own. So the question of, you know, where do we go from the events of Sheikh Jarrah and the Intifada of Unity, there needs to be sustained political organizing on the ground, coupled by political organizing online, because of course in this world, there's a lot of apathy, and of course with social media, it goes in cycles and waves. Right now, everybody's have their eyes on Ukraine, so it would be really hard. You know, let's say if the events of Sheikh Jarrah took place now, amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I don't think we would have received the same attention from the world to the plight of those families. So we can't really bet on online activism to deliver justice and freedom to the Palestinian people. And civil society, and I agree with Ahmed's conclusion that, you know, Palestinian civil society need to play a greater role in mobilizing Palestinians. Right now, it's been pretty much grassroots mobilization, and the big organizations, they do extremely important work on documentation, that kind of traditional, you know, human rights work. But they're also disconnected from the Palestinian populace to a certain degree. They fit in this Oslo paradigm, right? A lot of them still work on the hope of establishing a social contract of, you know, Palestinian citizenship. And going to the point on elections, I don't think you can actually build a democracy or maintain a democracy under military occupation. I mean, it's a disingenuous argument. I don't think it's politically viable. And let's not forget, when Palestinians did exercise last time their right to elect their president and the legislative council, the international community boycotted the results. And we all know what happened after that, you know, and then in terms of political fragmentation between Hamas and Fatah. And so, I'm moving in a lot of in different topics, but I just wanted to say that tomorrow we have local councils elections in the West Bank. So, you know, every now and then the PA kind of allows or permits, permits these elections to take place in a way to kind of let some steam off, and maybe to let Palestinians think or believe that they can exercise some political agency or can organize themselves. But the ceiling for that political participation in decision-making on what governs Palestinian lives and futures is really extremely low. I mean, we're talking about municipality elections. What do municipalities do in the West Bank? They provide water, they can build roads if they have money, and electricity. And not, you know, so that's the level of political organizing or participation, if you may, in the West Bank. And we have reached a point where, if we put all these different factors together, there is a huge responsibility for Palestinians to continue their mobilization and continue what they started in May 2021. I don't have answers to where we're going at the moment. You know, we're facing all sorts of odds. And there is not one Palestinian movement that is able to take the achievements of last year forward. So it's a bit of a huge challenge, but at least the hope has been rekindled, and we might see more new movements springing up soon.
Thank you. And yeah, it's nice to, it's a hopeful thought. And I think we're all held on to that moment of hope last year and are watching for that. I want to shift, we have time for two more relatively short rounds. So we've covered a lot of ground, and thank you both for that already. I want to narrow the focus to what we titled the session, and we gave it a provocative title on purpose: Where's the Palestinian Mandela? And this is the kind of thing that we as people working in Israel Palestine here in the United States hear really often, and it's usually used by critics of the Palestinians in the context of arguments suggesting that the absence of peace in the territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River is not due to settlements or policies of Israel or anything else. It's due to the failure of Palestinians to produce a courageous leader who is 100% committed to nonviolence, just like the people now misremember inaccurately Nelson Mandela and, say, Mahatma Gandhi, whose movements have now been reimagined when they actually were not entirely exclusively nonviolent. So I want to start with you, Ahmed. When someone says to you, as an activist and someone who was involved in the Great March of Return and all of that, when they say to you, where's the Palestinian Mandela? What do you respond to that question?
The simple and direct response that Israel killed many Mandelas in Palestine. Yes, I think there are many sides for this question. First, it's relating to the nature of the Israeli occupation and the Israeli colonization in Palestine. And there is a difference between the situation in Palestine and the situation in South Africa. Yes, Israel is a state of apartheid, but actually it's worse than apartheid. So it's the problem of Israel is not only that the racial discrimination based on the ethnicity or based on the religion. This is very clear in the Israeli policies, but there are many other sides that the uprooting of the Palestinian people, Nakba, and the ethnically cleansing, the massacres, the horrible massacres. There was no refugees in South Africa, but here in Palestine there are about 6 million Palestinian refugees. So Israel itself. It's not just a matter of that we as Palestinians, we need our civil rights to be equal with the Jewish citizens. This is a part of the problem, but not all the problem. There are many other. Israel want no Palestinians, zero Palestinians. The problem of Israel with the Palestinian existence itself. So this makes it more difficult than the situation in South Africa. But even we as Palestinians, we were inspired by the struggle in South Africa. And I think it's important here to mention that the establishment of the boycott movement, BDS, on 2005, and we know that this idea is inspired by the struggle of South Africa, and the activists who established the BDS are Palestinians from Palestine. And we know there are many activities across the world for BDS, and BDS message is very clear. It's based on the international law, and it's completely used the peaceful ways. But despite this, a clear image of and a clear activity of BDS, we saw how Israel tried to criminalize BDS across the world, and the Western governments, British government, and some states in the United States, they are working to criminalize the BDS. So the BDS is a Palestinian attempt to produce the Palestinian Mandela. The March of Return itself, the March of Return was an important opportunity for for the Palestinians to shift to the to a more clear struggle based on the human rights and based on the the rights and but Israel, and I think Israel deliberately filled this Palestinian tend to the peaceful and to the struggle based on the rights, because Israel want to keep the image that the Palestinians, Hamas and some militias, we fight against them in the same context of the war against the terrorism and like this. So yes, the nature of the struggle in Palestine is more difficult than the situation in South Africa. And Israel and its supporters across the world, they tried, and Israel itself, we know in many activities for the Palestinians, Israel suppressed them violently, because Israel want for the Palestinians to stay in the stigma it gave for them in the world. Yes.
Thank you. Marwa, can you answer the same question? And can you also, as an add-on to that one, talk about, again, with online activism, with civil society, Palestinian civil society today intertwined with international Israeli civil society, can you talk about the efforts to delegitimize Palestinian activism? Again, this Palestinian Mandela argument basically used to argue that where is the peaceful protest, and how you see that intertwining going forward between social movements, the non-Palestine focused ones and the Palestine focused social movements in the future.
Yeah, I mean, to your question, I don't subscribe to this mythology. I don't think Palestinians need a savior or a man, one man to run the show. As a matter of fact, I mean, one of the most inspiring and exemplary moments of Palestinian civil society in terms of mobilization, like mass mobilization and political organizing, is the first Intifada. And back then, there was a clandestine leadership. There were no icons or Mandelas. Nobody knew who they were. Of course, now we know. And communication was primitive. Either people were spraying messages with the spray cans on the wall, or extremely secretive. Schoolgirls hiding political leaflets in bread loaves. And it was at that time where the Israeli authorities were forced, for the first time in their occupation history, to sit down with the Palestinians to negotiate. And also this Mandela idea kind of dismisses the fact that Israel has one goal and one goal only, and that is to establish an ethno-nationalist Jewish state. And that stands in complete contradiction with the idea of coexistence, peace, and justice. So, of course, Israel has always used the line of, that we are ready for peace, but Palestinians are not ready. We're waiting for this Mandela to sit down with us. That's just them trying to buy themselves time to accelerate the building of illegal settlements in the West Bank. I mean, if we look at the number of settlements in when the Oslo Accords were signed to this moment in time, we have over 500,000, I think 600,000 settlers living in the West Bank. So it's just a matter of using the peace process, the so-called peace process. The whole Oslo paradigm is also made to, create a Palestinian Authority that is a subcontractor to the occupation. Israel got rid of its responsibilities as an occupying power under international law, and that is now being paid by the US and by the EU, the so-called international community, by pumping funds to the PA for education and garbage collection and I don't know what, like basic services. So it's been the most convenient occupation of all time to the Israeli government, while of course maintaining their system of apartheid. I mean, we have not discussed this enough today. Many international and Palestinian not political, but human rights organizations have concluded through their meticulous legal analysis that Israel commits the crime of apartheid, the most serious crime under international law in the League of Slavery, Torture, and Genocide. And most recently, actually this week on Monday, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine also concluded in his report to the Human Rights Council that Israel commits the crime of apartheid in the occupied territories. So within this constellation, how do we expect or believe that the only obstacle to peace is the emergence of the Palestinian Messiah or Mandela or Gandhi? I don't believe this is not a genuine argument. And as I said, this is not the path forward. What we actually need on the Palestinian side is to build a movement from the ground up, because the current political leadership, as we already discussed, has not served its purpose. And we need to come up with a new framework. We need to come up with new national goals. And that's incumbent upon us, really, for us to come up with a new leadership or a new form of governance or a new form of liberation movement. That's what we need, a national project and a national movement that represents us and our needs. To your second part, to the second part of your question on how can we use online spaces and connect with the outside world, with international organizations, with Israeli organizations that are also working on the same goals. As I said, the current digital ecosystem is not neutral. It's becoming increasingly authoritarian. Social media platforms are also not neutral, right? From using algorithms that curate everything we see and access, they pretty much control when and how and where we can access information using algorithms. And of course, they also decide on the terms of services. What is permissible on their platforms and what is not, and to our disadvantage as Palestinians, many of those policies criminalize, so to speak, Palestinian narratives, speaking about resistance or talking about ethnic cleansing, or the mass digital censorship and suppression we've seen done by platforms themselves last year. So it makes it we're starting again from a disadvantaged point of view. This being said, there are still pockets of space where Palestinians can connect with the outside world. There's definitely a narrative breakthrough that happened last year. Many organizations, seeing the most powerful and prominent human rights organizations in this world, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, turn around to do a different kind of analysis of the situation, where it's more accurate. We're not only talking about a military occupation, we're talking about an entrenched system, domination and apartheid. And that's definitely, we're moving the needle in the right direction. And hopefully changing the narratives is a start for hopefully changing policy action on behalf of the US by policymakers and lawmakers in the US and in the EU. That's, I think, the missing link at this point in time, where international organizations have had their say. Now we're still waiting to hear what those powerful governments around the world are going to comment on those developments.
Thanks, Marwa. And I'm glad that you brought up the subject of the first intifada, because this is actually going to be our last question to you. So if you could be as brief as possible, because we're almost out of time. But I want to kind of pose another provocative question to you all. When I look back at the first intifada, it's really quite striking. You mentioned how they were communicating using these very primitive modes of communication. Certainly nothing, nothing existed like what we have today of instant digital communication in real time. People were using fax machines and phones and word of mouth. But also, in terms of the role that civil society played, it really played a critical role in shaping and sustaining that uprising, because there was a moment, for example, when because schools were a hotbed of activity, Israel closed down the schools, and so civil society stepped in, and there were underground schools, and there were popular committees at the local level taking care of these sort of quasi-governmental functions. There was no Palestinian Authority back then, and yet civil society was able to keep things together and keep society from falling apart. So I fast forward to today, we often talk about or hear predictions that the PA could collapse, that the Palestinian Authority, or they're running out of funding, they lack legitimacy. There are all kinds of reasons that the PA could collapse. Given that, if something like that were to happen, what is the state of Palestinian civil society today? Is that something that Palestinian civil society is thinking about, planning for, that is the eventuality of Palestinian collapse? And if you could handle that very small question in under 2 minutes each.
I'll try my best. Yeah, I mean, so of course the PA wants us to believe that the moment it dissolves, it's going to turn into a complete chaos. And many of those who work for the PA, it's a source of income for many families. But I always say that Palestinians existed before the PA and are going to continue to exist after the PA. I don't think that there has been a collective brainstorming session where Palestinians are collectively answering this question, the aftermath of the PA. But I do believe in the will and the creativity of the Palestinian people. And I would not be surprised to see another level of organizing, organic grassroots organization. We've seen that to a certain degree actually last year. As I said, it was not, many of the protests did not happen because Palestinian factions said to Palestinians, go out on the streets. So I'm not too worried about that future. I think the Palestinians would be able to organize. For the specific question on the civil society, role of civil society, they do belong, some of them do belong to the Oslo era, and they might find it difficult to function. I mean, those who have been chasing after foreign funding and conducting programs that are not necessarily connected with the Palestinian people might not be able to fit to do the job, but we might find new modes of networking and of organizing that we have not necessarily seen, and the traditional players might not be the most prominent actors, but that's of course me speculating.
And Ahmed, same question to you.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, please correct for me if I go away from the answer. I think one of the points of the power in the first Intifada that the civil society didn't based on basically on the foreign finance, but it was like a kind of volunteer here. The idea of the volunteer here was very strong in the first Intifada, so this made it more stronger and also more revolutionary at that time, and more connected to the national struggle, Palestinian struggle. The problem today, in my opinion, that many NGOs, the NGOs depends on the as example, the European Union finance. This makes many restrictions, and sometimes you feel that the NGOs doesn't represent the real situation in Palestine, the real popular situation in Palestine. So we need to focus on more to focus on how to find the national lobbies, the popular lobbies based on the idea of the volunteer here in Palestine. This can make us stronger in the national role when when we need to or when some events happened like the first Intifada. So at that time we can find that that the situation will be stronger.
Thank you, Ahmed. And we are almost exactly on time. That's an amazing finish. So we're going to end here. I want to thank, on behalf of the Middle East Institute and the Foundation for Middle East Peace, I want to thank Marwa and Ahmed. Thank you so much for participating and carrying the extra load today. I also want to thank everyone who joined us for this webinar, and especially those who submitted questions. We appreciate your engagement. We hope you enjoyed today's session. We hope to see you again next Friday at the same time for what will be the final session in this series, which will look at another hot topic. The title is A New Era of Palestinian Unity, ? Which is something that we actually touched on today, but we're going to dig in much deeper next week. That will feature Lana Tatour from University of New South Wales in Australia, Dr. Yara Hawari from Al-Shabaka, and Tarek Bakoni, also of Al-Shabaka. So we will look for you then. So thank you so much.